filmmaker, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I am Mark Dickerson,
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
and today we are going to conclude our series on Peter Jackson, entitled Before Middle-earth, the early films of Peter Jackson.
We're going to move on to Jackson's final early film in our series, The Frighteners from 1996.
There has been a destructive force unleashed on this town such as I have never seen.
Oh my god, I don't believe this is not happening!
We have got a poltergeist!
Okay, well, folks, I can do a clearance, but it's not going to be cheap. Although I do offer a 6-month guarantee.
The Frighteners from 1996. This is Jackson's most ambitious film to date. I think it's pretty safe to say. You have Robert Zemeckis as an executive producer, Danny Elfman doing the music. I mean, this is a purely Hollywood production at this point for Peter Jackson. But having said that, this is still Peter Jackson we're talking about, and I still think he found a way to make his style and his humor prevalent throughout it. And it's still written with his life partner, Fran Walsh. He still filmed in New Zealand, though it was made to look like parts of the Western U.S. And so to just give a little background, The Frighteners is a horror comedy film, and it centers on the character played by Michael J. Fox. His name is Frank Bannister, and he develops abilities to speak and communicate with the dead following a car crash where his wife dies. And you find out more about that as the film goes. And basically, he creates his own service for people, service in quotes, where he hustles people, making them think that their house is being haunted, but really he's just, since he's affiliated with ghosts, he basically convinces them to haunt different locations, and then he comes in and saves the day. So he's a very cynical character. I actually thought his character was the most interesting part of the entire film, because there's layers to him, and he's kind of like struggling with a lot internally. But in the end, this film is a comedy. I want to call it an action movie as well. It's sort of an action comedy, especially what it progresses into. So that's the gist, and obviously things progress. There's actually a lot of plot details. There's
Very busy plotting.
It's a very, very busy plot. I would say probably a little too busy for my taste, but there's, so there's that plot of him hustling customers, and then
Death.
it delves into one of the customers that he becomes, I guess, romantically linked to eventually, but he becomes linked with them, and then whose husband dies, and then there's also a Grim Reaper character who's a ghost of a mass murderer who comes back and starts to murder people.
Who maybe has something to do with the Manson family and is. Yeah, it's a little convoluted.
Yeah, it's a little convoluted. That was my major problem with it. It goes a little bit too many places, because I thought that core narrative of the main character, the way he's swindling people and his internal struggle, I thought that, like I said, again, is the most interesting aspect to me. And I kind of wish they focused on that a little bit more. But it's almost like they're in the beginning, and then it kind of goes off into this kind of crazy action story.
Yeah, and to know where this film is coming from, I think we maybe need to look at the background a little bit. So initially, so Fran Walsh and Peter Jackson collaborated on the writing of this film. And it was originally going to be produced and directed by Robert Zemeckis, who of course did Back to the Future, Forrest Gump, and a slew of other huge Hollywood movies at that time. He was the hottest thing in town, and it was supposed to be directed by him as a Tales from the Crypt spinoff, which you can definitely see that a little bit, kind of in the zany horror, I don't know, for lack of a better word. But Zemeckis thought that the material would be better suited to Jackson's direction, which I mean, ultimately I think it was. I have a very hard time seeing Robert Zemeckis directing this stylistically. But really the thing that this film is most notable for is its special effects, it's digital special effects. At the time,
I definitely want to talk about that, because it's somewhat jarring introduction of CGI in this film because it was. I'm not sure if it was used at all in Heavenly Creatures at all. Probably not.
A little bit. I think some of the stitching, some of the like
Okay.
the fantasy sequences.
But obviously, it's used to a much larger extent in this film. And I don't know. What do you think of the CGI in this film?
I mean, I thought it was probably very believable at the time. You know, it was probably as good as
It
anything.
was still fairly new at
Yeah.
the time.
You know, I mean, you think about it, we get used to effects. It's like how we talk about, you know, on the Peter Jackson thing, like a movie like King Kong, the original King Kong, how people totally believed it then. You know, it's like we kind of accept what we see at the time, and then years later it doesn't necessarily hold up as well. But I'd imagine in 1996 these effects were, you know, as good as anything out there.
Well, the thing for me is, I mean, huge blockbuster movies had already come out using CGI to a great extent, like Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, and the CGI, it was actually done well in those films. I mean, full disclosure here, I'm going to come right out and say it. Episode 2, I do not like CGI. I'm not a fan of CGI.
Nor am I.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Unless used in a very subtle way.
And yeah, if it's used to enhance certain things, I mean, if it's done, yeah, even Jurassic Park, I thought they paid a lot of attention to detail, and it's used pretty sparingly for the most part. And they also incorporated animatronics, you know, with that. And I love, you know, animatronics and practical effects. I mean, makeup, that's the kind of stuff that I love, which is why I love Jackson's early films so much that we discussed.
Hands-on approach.
Because, yeah, that hands-on approach and the homemade quality, I really love about that. So this is very, like I said, jarring. To me, at least, with the CGI, there's a kind of overabundance of it in certain parts. And it's just a little janky and messy looking, but you know, it was 1996, so take that into account.
Still in its
yeah,
infancy.
I'm just not a fan of. Yeah, but like I said, full disclosure, not a fan of CGI, so that kind of took me out of the film a little bit more.
Yeah, it is interesting though in terms of the CGI. In my research, what I found is that the company Weta, WETA, that we had discussed on our last episode, they did the effects on this as they have continued to today do the effects on Jackson's movies, but they were running a little bit behind schedule, so they brought in a man named Wes, I'm gonna mispronounce this, Takahashi, I believe, Wes Takahashi of George Lucas's company Industrial Light and Magic, to kind of speed things up. So that I mean, that is a notable thing, just kind of that combination there. Once again, you know, we're really seeing, even though he said at the time he wasn't, we're really seeing for the first time Peter Jackson being integrated into the Hollywood, like the big blockbuster kind of Hollywood community. This is a big film, you know. The budget, I believe, on this was what, $30 million. But with that,
to date.
Yeah, this was also, or somewhere in that, but it was also his first box office bomb, really.
Yeah,
and maybe
it was interesting because the studio was so behind it, as you mentioned to me earlier, off we were not recording, but I thought that was interesting to talk about how behind it the studio was for this film.
Yeah, they were seeing
things ended up.
They were seeing his rushes and his dailies, and were just totally blown away.
Yeah, and they actually, I was going to talk about this later, but I'll bring it up now. The studio was behind it, and they also granted Jackson and Zemeckis total artistic control and the final cut of the film, which is pretty rare,
especially for a movie
when
of that budget.
There's a lot of studio involvement, yeah. So they really trusted them, and I guess when their returns were not what they were expecting, then that led to
it's all about the mighty dollar.
Yeah. Exactly. So
they actually
also means. Sorry.
They were actually so. One thing I learned too is they were so excited about this film that, of course, Peter Jackson is a huge King Kong fan, as we talked about multiple times on here. It was, you know, the movie that kind of inspired his whole career, and as we know, he went on to later remake King Kong in 2005. But at the time, this was 1996, because the studio, I believe Universal was the studio behind it, was so excited about what he was doing, they told him that he would get green-lighted to make a King Kong movie. And then when they saw how poorly this was doing in the box office, which, you know, obviously you can probably hear from our tone of voice, this isn't our favorite Jackson film. Well, I speak for myself. I assume, Mark, not yours as well. And it was okay, but what happened is they told him he could do King Kong, and then when they saw the film come out and not do well, they actually took back their offer for him to be able to do that.
Yeah. It's and also the shooting of it was very strenuous from what I read. It was actually the longest shooting schedule ever approved by Universal Pictures at the time.
Really?
So again, they were, they full steam ahead. Yeah, let's make this movie.
Do you know the number of days they were on for this one?
I have the dates. Shooting began on May 14th, 1995 and lasted until November 16th.
Wow.
Which, yeah, that's pretty long.
That's a very long.
So
especially for all the makeup and everything, like the
right,
actors must have been suffering.
Exactly. A lot of it apparently it was held as shoot because there were so many, effects involved. There was a lot of CGI, digital effects, which were still, as we mentioned, relatively new, especially to do a film with so many of those effects.
Yeah.
And a lot of the cast, a lot of the main characters are actually ghosts. So people were acting against blue screens, and they were acting by themselves. And so it just made it very strenuous and very complicated to complete. And also the fact you mentioned the special effects company Weta Digital, I think that's how you say it, they were relatively new at the time still. They were, I believe, only 3 years old at that time, so that was stressful, I'm sure, for them to take on such a big project like that.
Well, also in terms of, because I read a little bit about how they actually did the scenes with the ghosts, which is something that, I mean, notably we do see especially in Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King. We see those. I forget what they're actually called, but like the ghost kings, who are the green ghost-like figures, and they look, actually, if you look at them, it seems like they were probably done in the same way as this movie. But what they did is they would shoot the real actors on location, or on a sound stage. And then what they would have to do is they would have to be very precise with their movements, and then they would shoot other actors to play the ghosts on a blue screen later on, and then they'd have to lace them together. Which obviously means you're shooting every scene twice. So it makes sense that this ended up being a 6-month shoot, but obviously taxing on everyone involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this film really, for Jackson, as we've been alluding to, this is his most ambitious film to date, and for him it was a huge opportunity. He said, it was an opportunity to show what New Zealand filmmaking could do. Pretty much, he wanted to represent for New Zealand and show that, hey, we can make a big, expensive blockbuster action comedy, So he took on a lot more responsibility because of that than maybe he would have normally, or than most filmmakers probably would, because the executives at Universal actually proposed splitting some of the shooting to visual effects companies in the United States, but Jackson, wanting to represent for New Zealand, he wanted to keep everything in-house. And I think maybe that might be why the film doesn't work as much, or at least for me. Maybe there was too much going on behind the scenes as well as in the, in this actual plot. Maybe it was just I'm sure this was super stressful to film. It must have been. And there was a lot riding on it for Jackson. So.
Yeah, it just seemed like a lot of ideas going on every level, both in front of the camera, on the script, behind everything. It just seemed a little busy and ambitious. Clearly, I mean, I think everything that Jackson has done, he's not someone who repeats himself. He's incredibly ambitious, regardless of what he's doing. But sometimes, obviously, that doesn't always result in the greatest success when you take a risk like that.
Exactly, and it was definitely a big risk. And for him, we've touched on this a lot, just how gory and gruesome his earlier films were. I mean, a lot of it's done for comedy, but they're quite gory. So it's interesting to see this film. He actually was trying to go for a PG-13 rating, which for him seems kind of crazy. At least I thought it was.
Did he get it though? This was released as an R. Yeah.
This was released as an R. Even though Jackson fought for it to be PG-13, they did not give him that rating. So because he actually tried his best to omit a lot of the graphic violence from it. I mean, it's not that violent of a movie in the end. There's some moments that are, but so it still has an R rating. I guess because it's dealing with a lot of dark subject matter and stuff. I think that's more why. There's not too much bad language or anything like that. So yeah, so for him, this was a huge gamble. It was different for him. I think it was the most different out of all his films, even with Heavenly Creatures in the mix. I would say that this is probably his biggest departure that we've seen yet, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
but this was the film that preceded. So, like we said, this is the last in our series because this is the film that preceded what Jackson ultimately went on to be known for, which is Lord of the Rings. So that, I mean, that it's an interesting transition. It does seem like this movie, even though it wasn't as huge of a success, was a little bit of a stepping stone to
Mhm.
show that he could get out of that indie world and really command something big.
Did you have? I mean, we talked about how this is not our favorite of his films, but was there anything that stood out to you that you found interesting or that you maybe enjoyed on a certain level from this
I
movie?
really enjoyed the museum scene. There's a scene
Hmm.
when this Grim Reaper character, this ghost-like character, comes into an art museum, and I'm a huge art nerd in general. So there's a it's an art museum or like a natural history kind of museum, but there's an exhibition on ancient Egyptian, tombs and all that jazz. And so there's these ghost characters who our main character Bannister can see, but not everyone else can. And they basically come into this museum and start lifting up these mummies and making them move around, and it just felt very kind of playful
Hmm.
to me. And I think that maybe where this movie missed the mark is it was playful, but not playful enough or not serious
Hmm.
enough. It kind of was like towing that line in both directions, but
Yeah.
never really committed. So that
Hmm.
that was a scene, and I almost kind of wish that more of the movie had lived in that playful kind of fun
I
area.
totally agree. I totally agree. Because to me, this is Jackson's take on the Ghostbusters, right? I mean,
Yeah, a
in
little
a
bit. Yeah.
way, it's Ghostbusters amped up to 11 in a way, but maybe more cynical. Like even though I consider Ghostbusters a pretty cynical movie in certain ways,
Hmm.
but it also has that heartfelt, real desire to, I guess, understand the unexplained, and it does take its subject matter seriously. But with this, it's more of like a cynical, like, okay, I'm gonna, screw these people over who think I'm really a poltergeist, or I'm sorry, who think I'm really gonna exercise as poltergeist.
Hmm.
So it kind of comes at it from that aspect, which I thought was interesting. And if they had just focused on that aspect, I think it would have been a
Yeah.
lot more effective. I like
But
you
that's
said,
not
I
a
did,
studio movie.
but that's not a studio movie. It's right.
Yeah.
And like I said, I did appreciate the complexity of the main character played by Fox. I actually thought Michael J. Fox was really good in this movie.
Yeah.
It actually ended up being, I think, his last like major role before
Hmm.
he retired from acting. But and also to be on another positive note, because I do want to say positive things when I can. Jeffrey Combs, the main actor from the Reanimator films, he
Mm.
gives a very interesting, unhinged, energetic performance in this movie. He plays a character called Milton Dammer, and he kind of stands out for me from the rest of the characters. He attempts to expose Fox's character for what he believes he really is, and just he's super unhinged and fun to watch in this movie. And I don't know if you've ever seen the Reanimator films, Jeremy, but
Yeah, I've
those are
seen the
really
first Reanimator film.
yeah,
Yeah.
and those are really fun to watch, and he's fun to watch as an actor. So I like those aspects. And there are some interesting things going on with the plot. I mean, it's as we said, a little too messy as a whole, and a little too chaotic for its own good. And by the end, I think it turns into an all-out action movie. I would say,
Hmm.
um,
Well,
but
well,
I will say,
an
yeah,
important film nonetheless, though. An
it's
important film in
important.
his filmography, but maybe
Yeah,
skipped over a little bit.
yeah, you have to factor it into if you're going to look at his filmography. You have to look at it. But personally, I feel it is the weakest of his films up to this point,
Hmm.
especially after Heavenly Creatures. It's a bit of a come down, I thought,
Yeah.
from that film's pure vision and confidence, on its confident take on its material. I mean, the thing is with this one, Jeremy, it would be easy to blame the somewhat failure of this film on the studio,
Hmm.
but the fact that Peter Jackson supposedly had final cut
No.
and had so much involvement in this film. I mean, it means that there's likely more to it than just
Yeah.
the studio
Yeah.
telling them what to do.
I think we
So
could maybe pin the financial failure on the studio, in the way
yeah,
they promoted,
possibly,
but
yeah,
in terms of creatively,
yeah.
it just felt like Mark might have been missed a little bit on this guy.
It never really feels like it's grounded in any sort of reality. Also, to me, it felt like it was,
Hmm.
yeah, like we said, too all over the place. Um, but and also not Danny Elfman's strongest score. I thought it was
No.
kind of generic score. But now we're nitpicking. So
Yeah, yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
there's one good line I want to mention before we move on. And it comes from the character Dammer. Actually, he says, "I'm an asshole with an Uzi." I thought that was pretty good.
Mhm. No, that was great.
So there's at least one good, and that's like moments like that where it's like kind of being cheeky and like having fun. I mean, that's when the movie works the most. Like as we
Yeah.
mentioned, when the movie's
Personality.
having when it's having fun is when it works. So this is, as we said, the last of the films. that we're going to talk about for Peter Jackson, for the time being at least.
Any final thoughts looking at the series as a whole, Mark?
Series as a whole? Well, I mean, just there's lots of through lines that run throughout, and while his films, particularly from the first three to these two that we just discussed during this episode, while it deviates wildly, I say that there's still enough there. You know, as we said in the last episode, Jackson is an auteur. I mean, we can consider him that, and for lots of reasons. You know, he has a certain type of style and humor, the use of camera work, the way the camera moves, and the angles. He has these very extreme angles that he uses with his camera work, and that kind of goes even throughout up until Lord of the Rings. You still see it in Lord of the Rings, particularly in the Fellowship of the Ring. The early scenes in the Shire, you can really see a lot of that kind of handheld, quirky angles. You know, the way the camera moves and stuff. You can see a lot of that in Lord of the Rings. So even though he's working with much bigger budget and a lot of things are different, I think there's things that persist throughout all his films, and I think he's just a very enjoyable filmmaker in general, whether he's making Hollywood blockbusters or, movies in his backyard.
Yeah, I agree. I think that these films are just, they're important for younger filmmakers to see in particular, just because he's an inspiring character. Jackson is, just for the way he approached films. It seems like no challenge was kind of too big, and he wasn't afraid to just. I think it was Francis Ford Coppola said it. If you want to make a movie, just start making it, and then everyone else and all the pieces will come later. And I think Jackson really exemplifies that attitude in these movies, because it seemed like whatever he wanted to do, he kind of just went to town and found a way to make it work. So really, really excellent.
It was certainly interesting to watch his progression too, just watching all these films together, because I had seen them all except for The Frighteners. I think I had maybe seen parts of The Frighteners, but I've seen all these films prior to this, but watching them all together again in order, and you really see the progression that Jackson had as a filmmaker. So that was exciting to watch, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you notice anything about that when you were watching all these films together?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really see just the sophistication, particularly, I think, peaking in Heavenly Creatures, obviously within this set of films, and then really going to the next level in Lord of the Rings. Just the visual storytelling and the subtlety. Obviously Bad Taste doesn't have a lot of subtlety going on. It's very in your face, and I think exactly. I think even as like kind of with every film, until Heavenly Creatures, and through that, it really you just see the little moments just kind of growing and growing and growing to the point where just the way he can direct an actor. I also think he grew as an actor's director significantly in his time.
I would agree with that. Yeah,
definitely really learned how to direct actors. So yeah, good to see. Always good to see the progression of a career. And Peter Jackson is one of the finest filmmakers I think we've probably had, in the past 20, 30 years. So. Well,
there you have it. From cult movies to Lord of the Rings. Doesn't get more mainstream than that.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting look at Peter Jackson and his films. We're going to stop it there, because obviously Lord of the Rings is a whole different realm. And the remake of King Kong and all that, yeah. So we're going to move on to another series. Still in the works of what that's going to be, but we're excited to delve into a new subject. So please come back and listen, and we hope you enjoy what you've heard so far. If you could go ahead and give us a like, we would really appreciate it. Give us a review on iTunes. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook, Cult Movie Cult. And we'll put all the links in the description. And thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Yep, you've been listening to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. This has been our series Before Middle Earth, the early films of Peter Jackson, and we will see you next time on the other side.